The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, thin and gray against the bruised winter sky, and no one in Dakota Territory could find where it came from. There was no cabin standing on that slope, no soddy hunched against the wind, no dugout that any man on horseback could point to and name. Just smoke climbing from the frozen grass like the breath of something buried and patient, something that refused to die when the cold told it to. Alderman Josiah Crane had walked that hillside until his boots wore thin, searching for the structure that had to be there, hunting for the girl who had to be hiding inside it. He found snow. He found dead grass bent under frost. He found that single wisp curling up from nowhere at all, and every time he found nothing, the rage in his chest grew a little hotter. By the second week of December, he had told the town council the only thing his pride would let him say. The girl was dead, frozen out on the prairie like so many before her, and the smoke was some trick of the ground gas leaking up through the soil, the way it sometimes did in low country. The council nodded because it was easier to nod. But Crane knew the way a man knows a lie, even as it leaves his own mouth, that the girl was not gone. Ingrid Halverson lay 15 feet beneath the soles of his searching boots, warm in a bed she had built with her own raw hands, listening to him stamp across the roof of her hidden home. She was fed. She was breathing slow and easy. And when the great storm came in March, the one that would harvest the living across the whole territory, she would open her door to every soul who had laughed at the smoke from nowhere. To understand how a girl ended up living inside a hill, you have to go back to the autumn her father died. Anders Halverson had been a careful man, the kind who checked a saddle cinch twice and read the weather in the way cattle stood. He had carried his daughter across the cold gray water from Norway when she was 6, a small thing wrapped in wool with her whole memory of the old country fitting inside a single fjord and the smell of her mother's bread. On the Dakota prairie, he had raised her to survive, teaching her to read snow and tie knots and gut a rabbit before she was 9. The one thing he could not teach himself was how to choose a second wife, and that single failure would cost his daughter everything she thought she owned. He died on a clear October morning when his gelding spooked at the dry rattle of a snake coiled in the buffalo grass. The horse threw him hard against a stone, and the man who had survived an ocean and 20 Dakota winters was gone before the dust settled. Ingrid was 17. She buried him beside the creek with the help of 2 neighbors who left as soon as the dirt was tamped, and she walked back to the homestead that had been the only solid thing in her life, not yet understanding that it had already stopped being hers. She had spent the 3 days between the burial and the eviction in a kind of numbness she would later be ashamed of, moving through the chores out of habit, feeding the chickens, splitting the kindling, sweeping a floor she did not yet know she had lost the right to sweep. Her father's pipe still rested on the shelf where he had set it the morning of his last ride. His coat still hung by the door, holding the shape of his shoulders. She kept expecting him to come in from the barn, stamping snow off his boots, and each time the door stayed empty, the grief landed on her again as fresh as the first hour. She did not weep much. Anders had taught her that tears froze on the cheeks out here and stole the warmth the body needed to live, and so she had learned young to fold her sorrow inward where it could not betray her to the cold. Mabel Halverson waited until that 3rd day before she said the words she had clearly been saving since the funeral. The homestead belonged to the widow. Now the law was plain on that point, and Ingrid was no blood of hers and no burden she intended to shoulder. The girl could take the clothes on her back and go. There was no shouting in it, which somehow made it worse, just a flat certainty in the woman's voice as she stood in the doorway of the house Anders had built, already counting every board of it as her own. Ingrid had known Mabel was cold. She had not known the woman could empty a girl's entire world with so few words and so little feeling, the way a person might mention that the milk had gone sour. She tried once to argue. She reminded Mabel that Anders had brought the woman into a home he built, that there had to be some decency owed to the daughter of the man whose grave was not yet settled. Mabel only looked at her the way one looks at a stray dog that has wandered too close to the porch. Decency was a thing for people who could pay for it, the widow told her, and a girl with nothing was owed nothing. And the sooner Ingrid understood that the world kept no ledger for the deserving, the longer she might manage to stay alive in it. There was no malice in the way she said it, only a hard, practical contempt. And that absence of heat was the thing that finally convinced Ingrid there was nothing left to argue for. A person could fight anger. A person could not fight a closed account. She walked out past the barn where her father's tools still hung on their pegs, past the garden she had weeded since she was tall enough to hold a hoe, and the whole town of Havenwood watched her go with nothing but the dress she stood in and the knowledge packed inside her skull. Word of a man's death traveled fast in that country, and word of his widow's hardness traveled faster, so that by the time Ingrid reached the main street, there were faces in every window watching to see what the cast-out girl would do. None of them opened a door. None of them offered a meal or a bed or a wagon seat. They watched the way people watch a thing happening to someone else, grateful in the private rooms of their hearts that it was not happening to them. Josiah Crane was the first to speak, and he spoke loud enough that the whole frozen street could hear him. That was what came of raising a child without discipline, he announced to anyone listening, and a decent girl would have made herself useful to her stepmother instead of wandering off like a stray. A decent girl wouldn't shame her father's memory by drifting across the prairie like a vagrant with no roof to claim. The words were meant to land on Ingrid, but they were truly meant for the crowd, a performance of righteousness for an audience that wanted permission not to help, and the crowd took the permission gladly, turning back to their warm rooms with their consciences quieted by an alderman's judgment. What the street did not know, what Ingrid herself did not yet understand, was why the alderman's contempt cut so sharp and so personal. Crane had buried a daughter of his own 4 winters back, a girl of 14 named Sarah, lost in a January cold snap because the family had trusted a house that turned out to be thin against the wind. He had told himself ever since that preparation was vanity, that the prairie killed whoever it pleased, no matter how clever they thought they were, and that anyone who claimed to outwit the cold was a fool who would teach their lesson to others by dying. A girl who walked off into the open with that calm look in her eye offended something raw and unhealed in him. He needed her to fail. He needed the prairie to prove him right, because if she lived, then his own daughter had died for nothing but a flimsy roof and a father's bad judgment, and that was a thing Josiah Crane could not afford to believe and go on breathing. Ingrid did not weep as she walked out of town. She had wept enough at the graveside, and the tears had frozen on her cheeks and taught her once more that grief out here was a luxury that stole warmth a body could not spare. Instead, she let her mind go back the way her father had taught her to, in hard moments, to the lessons that mattered. And the lessons that mattered had not come from school or church. They had come from old Otto Brandvold, the Norwegian bachelor, who had broken this ground 30 years before there was a single street to call a town. She was 12 again in the memory, holding a sod block, while her father patched the barn, and Otto was talking the way he always talked, slow and certain, as if the earth itself had told him its secrets and sworn him to repeat them. The ground keeps one temperature the whole year round, he had told her, 55 degrees, give or take a hair, and it doesn't care if the air above it is 40 below or blistering July. The earth remembers summer, he said, and it holds that warmth down in the dark until summer comes back to claim it. He had shown her the first true dugout in the territory, not a soddy squatting on top of the prairie where every wind could find it, but a home carved into the south face of a hill where the low winter sun would warm the doorway, and the soil itself would wrap around a person like a second skin. He had learned it, he said, from the Lakota, who had shown him how to build a shelter that vanished from the eyes of anyone hunting it, a home that could disappear entire beneath a single night's snowfall. She had listened to every word that day, the way a child listens to a story without knowing it is also a map. She remembered how the old man's hands had moved as he spoke, tracing the angle of an entry passage in the air, miming the way water would run off a properly built roof. She remembered her father nodding along, taking it seriously when the other men of the county dismissed Otto as a hermit who talked to the dirt. Anders had believed there was wisdom in the old ways, that the new ways were too proud to keep, and he had wanted his daughter to carry that belief. She had not understood then that she would one day need each detail to keep her own heart beating. Now walking away from everything, with nothing she understood. There was an old man 5 miles from town who knew how to make a person disappear into the ground and live, and he was the only door left open to her in the whole wide cold of the world. The walk to Otto's homestead took the better part of a day on foot, and by the time she reached it, the light was failing and her feet had gone past pain into a frightening absence of feeling inside her thin boots. She did not waste the breath to explain what the old man could already read on her face. She needed to learn what he had taught her father, she told him through cracked lips. She needed to build into the earth. Otto studied her for a long moment from beneath brows gone white, as the frost and something in his face shifted some weighing of the girl against the winter that was coming. He had heard about Anders, he told her at last, and he had wondered how long it would take her to find her way to his door. Then he nodded once slow, and she understood she had passed a test she had not known she was taking. What he told her next changed the shape of her despair into something with edges she could grip. There was a hill on the far margin of her father's old claim. He said a piece of ground Anders had never bothered to file because he had judged it worthless, 30 acres of nothing but grass and slope that Mabel did not even know existed. It was hers if she had the will to take it. The widow would come hunting, eventually the old man warned, but she would not find what she could not see, not if the girl built the way the Lakota built. He smiled then, showing teeth ground down by decades of hard bread and harder weather, and told her to come along that he would show her where to dig. That smile, more than any promise, was what Ingrid would remember as the hinge of her whole life. She had walked out of Havenwood believing the prairie had nothing left to offer her but a quiet death. An old man with ruined teeth had just handed her a hill and a future, and the only price was her own willingness to claw it out of the frozen ground with her bare hands. She did not hesitate. She would later say that the day Mabel threw her out was the day she stopped being a girl who waited for the world to be kind and started being a woman who built her own kindness out of dirt and patience. That first night, she slept on the floor of Otto's one-room shack, wrapped in a buffalo robe that smelled of wood smoke and old age, and for the first time since her father's death, she slept without the dread of the morning. The old man fed her cornmeal mush and salt pork and watched her eat with the satisfaction of a man who has found a use for himself again. He had no children, he told her no kin in this country, or the old one, and the knowledge he carried had been weighing on him for years, like a debt he could not find anyone to pay it to. Most folks thought him cracked. They built their proud houses on top of the ground and froze in them, and never once wondered whether the strange old Norwegian might know something they did not. He had stopped offering. A man could only watch people refuse his help so many times before he learned to keep it behind his teeth. But here was a girl with nowhere to go and everything to learn, and Otto Brandvold felt the years drop off him at the prospect of teaching her. They began the next morning while the topsoil still gave under a blade racing the freeze that would turn the whole prairie to iron. Ingrid dug and Otto supervised from a stump, his arthritic hands too twisted now to hold a shovel, but his memory still carrying every angle and measure of the technique. The work was brutal beyond anything her father's chores had prepared her for. The ground fought back. Roots clung like the fingers of the dead. Stones turned up where the blade least expected them, ringing against the steel and shivering up her arms until her teeth ached and her elbows went numb. By the end of the first day, her palms were torn open and weeping, and Otto wrapped them in strips of cloth without a word, then told her to dig with her wrists, turned a certain way so the blisters would heal hard instead of soft. She worked until she could not lift the shovel, and then she worked a little longer because the freeze was coming and a half-dug hole would shelter no one. Otto did not let her break herself. He had buried strong young men who thought their bodies were endless, he told her, and he would not bury her the same way. He taught her the rhythm of long labor, the slow, steady pace that a person could keep from dawn to dark without burning out the trick of resting the mind even while the hands kept moving. He taught her to eat before she was hungry and drink before she was thirsty, because out here, the body that waited for its needs to announce themselves was already losing. Every lesson was survival dressed as a chore, and Ingrid soaked them up the way the dry autumn ground soaked up the first rain. She worried that first week that the two of them could never carve a home large enough before the ground locked solid, and the worry must have shown because Otto did something she had not expected. On the fourth morning, he arrived with help. Two Lakota men he had known across 30 years of mutual respect rode in with him, men named in their own tongue, but called Eagle Track, and the younger Two Hawks by the settlers, who could not manage the proper words, men who had taught Otto the very art he was now passing down. With them came a half-grown boy, eager for the work and the trade goods it would earn. They did not dig for charity, and they did not dig for free. Otto traded them powder and iron and a standing welcome at his fire, and the four of them turned what would have taken one girl a desperate winter into something that could be finished before the deep cold closed the door. Ingrid learned more in those weeks watching their hands than she could have learned alone in a year of seasons. Eagle Track showed her how to read the way a wall of earth would hold or slough, pressing his palm flat against the soil and feeling for the give that warned of collapse. He showed her how to brace a roof of cut sod so the weight pressed inward and grew stronger rather than bearing down to crush the same principle. He told her through Otto's halting translation that held up the great earth lodges his people had built on the rivers long before any settler came west. The younger two hawks taught her to angle the long entry passage so meltwater would run away from the door instead of pooling at her threshold, and to set the entrance behind a natural fold so the wind would break against the hill before it ever found the gap. They worked without wasted motion, these men, with a patience and a respect for the ground that reminded her of her father. And she understood that the wisdom Otto carried had not been his to invent, only his to keep and pass along. The boy, who could not have been more than 13, took a particular delight in showing her how to disappear the chimney. He gathered stones of the right shape and color and arranged them around the slender pipe in a scatter that looked exactly like a natural outcrop, then stood back and grinned at his own handiwork. And Ingrid grinned back, and for an hour the grief and the cold and the fear of the coming winter lifted off her in the simple shared pleasure of building something well. She would remember that boy for the rest of her life, though she never learned his proper name because he had given her the first laughter she had managed since her father died. And laughter, she was learning, was its own kind of survival. Word of her labor traveled back to town the way smoke travels, thin but impossible to fully hide. The Halverson girl was digging into a hillside. People murmured over the counter at the mercantile, living like a badger scraping out a burrow in the dirt, like an animal too stupid to know it was beaten. The talk pleased Josiah Crane the way a scab pleases the tongue. He could not let it alone. He gathered a dozen men in late October and rode out to the far hill, expecting to find the girl crouched in a muddy hole, half mad, and ready to be marched back to town as a lesson in what came of pride. He told the men it was a matter of public concern that a girl living wild might steal from honest farms, but the truth was simpler and meaner than that. He needed to see her fail with his own eyes. They found nothing. The entrance to the dugout sat tucked behind a fold in the slope, blind to anyone approaching from the obvious direction. The chimney pipe rose no higher than a man's knee and stood ringed by that careful scatter of stones the boy had arranged, looking as though the prairie had set them there itself in some forgotten age. The only proof that anyone had ever stood on that hill was a faint thread of wood smoke hanging in the still, cold air, and a thread cannot be arrested or driven out of town. One of the riders allowed that maybe the disturbed earth was just the work of badgers after all. Crane insisted otherwise, jabbing a gloved finger at a patch of churned soil. But the more he insisted, the more foolish he sounded, and the men's silence began to curdle into the particular quiet of people humoring a man past the point of reason. They searched for an hour. They walked, every one of them, directly across the roof of Ingrid's home, without the faintest notion that a girl lay listening beneath their boots. Her breath held her heart slamming so hard she was certain they must hear it through the sod. She had been working at her shelves when the hoofbeats came, and Otto had hissed at her to bank the fire and lie still, and so she lay in the dark with the warm earth around her, listening to the men who had come to destroy her home walk back and forth across its roof, cursing the cold and the wasted ride. She stood close enough to her hidden door that she could have reached out and touched a stranger's heel through the gap, and not one of them saw the seam in the hillside. When they finally mounted up and rode back toward town, Crane's parting words drifted down through the earth to where she crouched in the dark, and they planted something in her that would take all winter to grow. The girl was up to something, he swore to his men. No honest soul hid like a creature in a hole. She was surely stealing from the farm's roundabout, living off whatever she could pry loose from decent folk in the dark. The injustice of it, the sheer backward cruelty of being called a thief by men who had ridden out specifically to rob her of the only thing she had built, settled into Ingrid's chest like a coal she would never quite let go cold. She had taken nothing from anyone. She had been given a worthless hill by an old man and had turned it into shelter with the skin of her own hands. In the wisdom of men, the town would have scorned even more savagely than they scorned her. And for that, she was a thief, a liar, an animal. She lay in the dark long after the hoofbeats faded and made herself a quiet promise that she would not become the bitter thing they were trying to make of her. She would not steal. She would not crawl back. She would simply live and let her living be the only answer she ever gave them. When she climbed up at last and opened her door to the clean, cold dusk, Otto was waiting outside on his old horse, and he read the set of her jaw and told her the only revenge worth having was to outlast the people who wished you dead. The grave was patient, he said. It would take Crane in its own time, the same as it took everyone, and a girl had better things to spend her short years on than hatred. Through the iron weeks of November and into the bone of December, the home took shape. The Lakota men finished their part and rode off with their trade goods before the deep snow closed the trails, and after that it was Ingrid and Otto alone, the girl's young strength and the old man's long memory. Otto came when his joints allowed hauling out the few things her hands could not conjure from prairie and creek. He brought a single small pane of glass cradled in a blanket so she could have a window to the daylight set high in the entry passage where the low sun would find it. He brought iron hinges so her door could swing true and seal tight against the wind. He brought a small efficient stove that would throw heat from the least fuel and send its smoke up through a pipe so slender it read from any distance as a stick of deadwood poking through the snow. Each gift was a small rebellion against the death the town had assigned her, and each one she received with a fierce private gratitude she did not have the words to speak aloud. She lined the earthen walls with dried grass packed tight, and over that she hung buffalo hides Otto had cached against just such a need decades before, so the dirt would never crumble down into her bedding. She built her furniture from cottonwood she dragged on a sledge 3 miles from the creek, a table that did not wobble, 2 chairs, shelves that climbed the curved walls, and filled slowly through autumn with the harvest of a garden she had hidden in a sun trap of the hill where no rider would think to look. She had planted that garden in secret through the last warm weeks, turnips and squash and hardy greens screening it with brush so that from any distance it looked like nothing but a tangle of wild growth. She dug a second room deeper than the first, a cellar colder than her living space, and into it she stacked the smoked flesh of rabbits and prairie chickens. She had snared the roots and squashes she had coaxed from her stolen pockets of soil. Every jar, every hide, every split log was an argument against the verdict Havenwood had passed on her. The work taught her things about herself she had not known. She learned that she could be alone for days and not lose her grip on the world, that the silence of the earth was a companionable thing rather than a frightening one, once a person stopped fighting it. She talked to her father in that silence, told him about her day, asked him questions. She answered in his voice the way she remembered it. She was not mad. She knew the difference between memory and madness. But the conversations kept the loneliness from hollowing her out, and they kept her father near, and she reckoned there was no harm in a habit that did her good. Some evenings Otto would come and sit by her stove, and they would talk of Norway, of the country. Neither of them would ever see again the deep fjords and the steep green farms and the long summer light, and the old man's eyes would go distant and young. And Ingrid would understand that homesickness was a thing that never fully healed, only learned to live quietly inside a person. And every morning the smoke rose thin and gray, visible for miles across the white, and not one soul could trace it to its root. Crane sent 3 more parties before the deep snow shut the trails for good. Each rode out hard and each rode back empty, and with every failure the smoke from nowhere climbed higher in the town's imagination until it stopped being a girl at all and became a ghost story to swap across the bar. Maybe the prairie itself was burning from the inside, some men joked. Maybe it was the spirit of the dead Halverson girl warming her own grave through the long nights. Maybe, said a bolder soul one evening to a saloon thick with laughter, the trouble was simply that Josiah Crane could not find his own backside with the help of both hands and a lit lantern. The room roared. Everyone laughed but Crane, who sat with his jaw working and the old grief turning to acid behind his eyes, hating the smoke, hating the girl, hating most of all the small, cold voice in him that whispered she was beating him at the only game that had ever mattered out here, which was the game of staying alive. By the middle of January, the home was finished, 12 feet across and 20 deep, its walls holding that steady 55, no matter how murderously the air above it behaved. Ingrid had a bed framed into the wall and warm with hides, a place to sit and a place to eat, shelves that groaned with food, a stove that breathed gentle heat into the dark while a blizzard might be screaming itself hoarse across the prairie overhead. She had a home that no man could find and no widow could claim and no alderman could take from her with a word. For the first time since her father's horse threw him against that stone, she lay down at night without fear of the morning, and the fearlessness was so unfamiliar that it kept her awake the first few nights the way fear once had. Otto came to see it finished on a day the air had dropped to 30 below, the kind of cold that turned a careless breath to needles in the lungs and froze a man's lashes shut between blinks. He came down through the hidden entry, stood in the center of the warm, dark room, and turned a slow circle, taking the measure of what the girl had made. "Your father would have stood proud at this," he told her, and his voice carried something thicker than approval. This was better, he said, than anything his own younger hands had ever managed, warmer and tighter and more truly hidden, and the men who had laughed would never find her here. She answered that this was exactly what she had wanted to be unfindable, to be safe from every searching boot. The old man's face went grave then, in a way that pulled the warmth out of the moment. They would never find her, he agreed. But there might come a day, he said quietly, when they would need to. She asked him what he meant, and the answer he gave her settled over the little room like a shadow she could not shake. They laughed at her now, she said, called her an animal living in a burrow. And when the storm came, the old man replied, they would be the ones dying like animals in the open. And on that day, she would have a choice to make that no amount of digging could prepare her for. He had seen the signs already. He told her the long warmth where there should be cold, the wrong-headed birds, the cattle huddling for no reason a man could name. Winter was not finished with the territory. Something was building out beyond the horizon, the kind of storm that did not pass through a country so much as erase the parts of it that were not ready. And when it broke this hole in the ground, would be the only mercy for miles in any direction. February proved the old man right in ways that frightened her more than any blizzard yet had. The weather went strange and treacherous days of false spring warmth that softened the snow into mush, followed without warning by sudden plunging freezes that locked everything in glass. The wind could not decide on a quarter and swung wild from one hour to the next. Otto watched the sky each morning and shook his white head and said only that it was coming, that he could feel it grinding closer in the marrow of his old bones, the way a man with an old wound feels the rain before it falls. Ingrid believed him. She had no reason left in the world to doubt the man who had handed her survival. She stockpiled more wood than she thought she could ever burn, hauling deadfall from the creek timber until her sledge runners wore thin. She built a cache of food at the very mouth of her entry where it could be hauled inside in minutes. She cleared and checked and rechecked her chimney until she was certain no drift could choke it and smother her in her sleep. She prepared, in short, for a thing that might destroy the whole territory or might never come at all, and she did it without complaint because preparing was the only prayer she trusted. The town of Havenwood prepared for nothing. The buildings stood solid, the men assured one another, real lumber and real nails, not dirt scraped from a hill like some animal's den. Winter was nearly spent. Whatever doom the old Norwegians muttered about was the superstition of people who had lived too long alone with the wind. When word of Otto's warnings reached Josiah Crane, he laughed it off, the way he laughed off everything that threatened his certainty. Those people thought every cloud carried the wrath of God, he scoffed. Havenwood had weathered Dakota winters before, and would weather this one, and a man would do better to trust good timber than the bone aches of a hermit. He did not know, could not let himself know, that he had just spoken the very confidence that had killed his own Sarah 4 winters gone, the unshakable faith in a solid roof that the prairie was about to test to ruin once again. Late in February, on an evening when the false warmth had returned thick enough to drip from the eaves of the dugout's entry, Mabel Halverson came hunting after all. She did not come to the hill, for she could not find it any more than Crane could. She came instead to old Otto's homestead with a paper in her gloved fist and a hardness in her face that even the old man's long patience could not soften. Word had finally crawled back to her that the Halverson brat was not dead in a ditch, as she had assumed, but living somehow somewhere on land the dead man had owned. And a widow who had claimed one piece of her husband's estate meant to claim the rest, every worthless acre of it, before some clever girl could find a way to call it her own. She had been to the land office, she told Otto, her voice flat as a frozen pond. She meant to file on the unclaimed parcel, the 30 acres of slope and grass that Anders had never recorded. And once it bore her name, the girl squatting on it would be a trespasser. The law itself would help her drive into the snow. She did not know precisely where the girl had dug in, she admitted, but a trespasser could be hunted with the full weight of a deed behind her, and she would hire men if she had to, and turn over every fold of that hill until she found the hole and filled it with the girl still inside. The old man heard her out without a flicker, and when she had finished, he told her only that the weather was turning and she would be wise to be home before it broke. She mistook his calm for weakness and rode off satisfied, never guessing that Otto Brandvold had outlived a dozen people who had mistaken his calm for weakness, and that he had already taken quiet steps of his own months before. When Mabel had gone, Otto made his slow way out to the hidden hill through the gathering dusk to tell Ingrid what was coming. He found her hauling the last of the entry cache into shelter, and he gave her the news plainly, the way he gave her everything. The widow had not given up. The widow had gone to the law to take the very ground beneath her feet in a paper in a land office could undo, in a single afternoon what months of digging had built. Ingrid stood very still in the warm dark with a sack of smoked rabbit hanging forgotten from her hand. After everything, after the blisters and the cold and the loneliness, after building a home no man could find, she might yet lose it, not to the prairie, but to a signature she would never even see. The unfairness of it threatened for one black moment to do what the whole winter had failed to do and break her. Then Otto told her the rest, and the black moment passed like a cloud sliding off the sun. He had not been idle while she dug, he said. He had carried a thing of his own to the land office back in November, the very week he had handed her the hill, because an old man learns hard and early that a gift left unrecorded is a gift easily stolen. He had filed on the parcel himself in trust with two witnesses who would swear to the truth of it with the clear written intent that the claim passed to Ingrid Halverson on the day she came of legal age. Mabel could file all the papers she liked. She would find the ground already spoken for, already standing in a stronger name than her spite could overturn. The girl was not a trespasser on her own hill. She was its rightful heir, protected by the same law the widow had hoped to wield against her like a club. Ingrid set down the sack of meat with hands that had stopped shaking. She did not have words large enough for what the old man had done, so she gave him the only thing she had, which was the truth. She said that her father had chosen badly in a wife, but well in a friend, and that whatever came down out of the sky in the weeks ahead, she would face it, knowing that one human being in the whole cold world had bothered to protect her before she even knew she needed protecting. Otto only grunted and lowered himself onto one of her cottonwood chairs and held his twisted hands out toward the stove. The storm was close now, he said, closer than the widow knew, closer than the town would believe until it was on top of them. And when it came, the girl they had all tried so hard to bury was going to find out exactly what she was made of, because the earth could shelter a body, but only a soul could decide whether to open the door. The last evening of February, the wind died completely, and the silence that followed was the most frightening thing Ingrid had ever heard. The prairie did not go quiet for nothing. She stood at her hidden entrance in the blue dusk and watched the western sky where a wall of cloud the color of old iron was building so high and so fast that it seemed less like weather than like the edge of the world itself rolling toward her. Far off, almost too faint to be sure of, she heard the lowing of frightened cattle drifting across the still air, and beneath it, fainter still, the brittle, ordinary sound of a town going about its evening with no idea at all. She thought of her father, who had read the sky better than any man and still been killed by a thing as small as a snake. She thought of Otto's warning of the choice he had promised would come for her, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her that the same hill which had hidden her from cruelty might soon have to reveal itself to save the cruel. She went back down into the warm dark and barred her door against a wind that had not yet begun to blow. She banked her stove and lay in her bed framed into the earth and listened to the silence press down on the world above her like a held breath. Somewhere 5 miles east, the lamps of Havenwood would be guttering one by one, as good solid families settled into good solid houses, trusting timber and nails the way Josiah Crane had taught them to trust the way his own dead daughter had trusted. None of them knew that the smoke they had laughed at all winter was the only fire in the territory that would still be burning come the thaw. None of them knew that a 17-year-old girl they had called a thief and an animal lay calm beneath the frozen grass, fed and warm, and ready with a door she could choose to open or keep shut. And as the first faint moan of the rising wind finally reached down through 20 feet of earth to where she waited, Ingrid Halverson closed her eyes and understood that the long, quiet test of the winter was over, and the real one was about to begin. The first night of the storm, the wind found Havenwood the way a wolf finds a wounded calf circling once before it tore in. Ingrid woke to no sound at all from the world above, only the deep stillness of 20 feet of earth, but she felt the change the way a swimmer feels a current shift in dark water. She climbed her short ladder to the entry and cracked the door against a pressure that shoved back at her like a living hand. Beyond the fold of the hill there was nothing to see, no horizon, no sky, no ground, only a roaring white wall that had swallowed the prairie whole. The temperature had fallen so far so fast that the moisture in her own breath crackled to ice the instant it left her lips. She pulled the door shut, dropped the bar, and stood in the warm dark, listening to a sound that came down through the soil like the groan of the world straining at its hinges. 5 miles east, the town learned in a single afternoon what the old hermit's bones had known for weeks. The mild morning of the 2nd of March had fooled them all, families sending children to gather eggs in shirt sleeves, men leaving wood piles half-stacked because the air felt like the front edge of spring. By noon, the mercury had plunged 40 degrees with no warning a townsman could read. By dark, the wind ran at 60 miles an hour through streets where a person could no longer see the building across from their own door. The snow did not fall so much as fly sideways, fine as flour, and hard as driven sand, working into every gap that good lumber and honest nails had left between them. The solid houses Josiah Crane had bragged on began one by one to fail in the ways solid things fail when the prairie decides to remind them what it is. The Pruitt place lost its roof in the small hours of the second night, the wind peeling it back like the lid of a tin, and a family of 5 spent the rest of that darkness pressed into a root cellar, breathing the steam of their own terror and listening to their home come apart above them. The widow Henley, who had no cellar, burned every chair and every shelf, and at last the very door of her bedroom to keep her grandchildren from freezing. And when the storm finally broke, she had nothing left to sit on and 3 living children to thank for it. By the third morning, the mercantile's roof had buckled under a load of snow no one had thought to clear, burying half the town's flour and lamp oil under tons of frozen ruin, and with it the husband of the woman who would later weep at a stranger's grave. Men who had laughed at a girl for living in dirt now burned their own furniture stick by stick, watching their children's beds become ash because the woodpile lay 40 feet away across a void that would kill anyone who tried to cross it. Crane sat in his cooling parlor with a quilt around his shoulders and listened to a neighbor's livestock screaming in a barn no one could reach, and the sound carried him back 4 winters to another roof, another cold, another helplessness he had spent every year since pretending he had buried. He had told himself for 4 years that Sarah's death had been the prairie's doing, and no one's fault, a thing as random as a snake under a horse's hooves. Now, with the wind unmaking his certainty board by board, he could no longer hold the lie together. He had built that house. He had chosen the thin lumber to save money for a finer parlor. He had laughed off the warnings of the old-timers, then too the same way he had laughed off Otto's, and his daughter had paid the bill. His pride ran up. The storm did not let him look away from it. The storm pressed his face against the truth, the way a hard man presses a pup's nose to its mess, and Josiah Crane wept alone in the dark for the first time since the day they put Sarah in the ground. Out on the hidden hill, Ingrid did not suffer. The earth held its patient warmth exactly as the old man had promised, the stove sipping fuel and breathing heat into a room that stayed survivable, while the country above it turned to a graveyard. She rationed nothing yet. She slept, she tended her fire. She listened to the storm rage itself hoarse against ground. It could not reach her through, and she felt beneath her gratitude the slow growth of a guilt she had not expected. She was warm because she had been thrown away. She was alive because the town had been cruel enough to drive her into the only shelter that would survive this. The injustice that had nearly broken her in autumn had by some bitter arithmetic become the very thing keeping her heart beating, and she did not know yet what she was supposed to do with that knowledge. Otto had warned her the choice would come, but he had not warned her how it would arrive, which was the way most terrible choices arrive, wearing the face of someone she could not turn away. On the 4th day of the storm, in a brief slackening of the wind, she heard a sound that did not belong to weather, a thin, ragged scraping at the fold of the hill above her entry. She climbed and opened her door to a swirl of stinging white, and there, half buried, dragging himself by the elbows through a drift that had nearly become his grave, was old Otto Brandvold. He had gone out into it. That was the thing she understood before he could speak, the thing that filled her chest with a love and a fury so tangled she could not have named the sum. The old man, twisted with age, slow on his feet, had ridden out from his own safe homestead into the worst storm the territory had ever produced, because he had known something the town did not and could not bear to keep it to himself. His horse was gone, lost, or dead, somewhere behind him in the white. His beard was a solid sheet of ice. His eyes, when they found her face, held no fear at all, only the flat exhaustion of a man who has spent the very last of himself reaching a door he was not sure existed anymore. She hauled him down out of the wind by main strength, her arms shaking with the dead weight of him, and got him onto her own bed and stripped the frozen wrappings from his hands. The fingers were the gray-white of tallow. She knew that color. Every prairie child knew that color, knew what it meant, and how little time it gave. She rubbed snow into them first the way her father had taught her. Never heat, never the stove, because warming frostbitten flesh too fast killed it surer than the cold ever could. Otto watched her work with the ghost of his old smile pulling at his cracked lips. He had gone, he managed at last, his voice a ruin, to warn the Tollefson family on the North Road, the ones with the new baby, because he had reckoned their house the weakest in the county, and their souls the least deserving of what was coming. The words landed in her like stones dropped down a well. He had reached the Tollefsons, he told her, slow and broken between breaths, found them already gone east toward the church. Days before the snow found the house empty, turned for home, lost the road in the white, lost the horse to a drift that swallowed it to the withers, lost his bearings until the only thing left in the whole roaring world was the faint memory of where a girl had dug into a hill. He had not been sure he could find it. He had not been sure it was real. He had crawled the last half-mile toward a column of smoke he could only see in his mind, betting his life on the one fire in the territory he trusted to still be burning. She got broth into him, then heat by slow, careful degrees, then the deep, racking shivering that meant his body still had fight left in it. But she had seen too many hard winters not to know what the gray fingers foretold. Otto Brandvold was not going to walk out of her dugout, the man who had walked into the prairie. The storm had taken something from him out there that no stove could give back, some final measure of an old body's strength that had been spent freely and would not be returned. She sat beside him through the long dark, while the wind clawed at the hill, holding the hand that had handed her a future understanding that the price of her survival was now lying in her own bed, breathing slow, and that there would be no bargaining the price down. When he woke in the deep of that fourth night, he did not waste his returning breath on his own condition. He asked instead about the smoke. She had kept the fire going, she told him, kept it visible because she did not know what else to do. The old man nodded slowly against the hide pillow. Keep it burning, he told her, no matter what the cold does to the fuel, no matter how dear the wood becomes. A fire that cannot be seen saves no one. The smoke from nowhere, he said, the thing they had laughed at all the long winter, was going to become the most important thing in this whole country before the thaw, because somewhere out there, a man who had hunted her was going to see it at last and finally understand what it meant. He was right, of course. He had been right about everything, which was its own kind of cruelty, since being right had cost him so dearly. On the fifth day, when the wind dropped enough to let shapes resolve out of the murk, Josiah Crane stood at the window of his failing house, wrapped in every quilt he owned, watching two of his neighbors lie where they had fallen between the houses and not get up. And he saw it. Far to the west, thin and gray and steady against the white wreck of the world, a thread of smoke climbed from a hillside that held no building any man had ever found. He had searched for that smoke all winter to destroy its maker. Now he stared at it through frosted glass, with his own death sitting cold in his belly, and the prayer that left him was the truest thing he had said in 4 years. God help him, he breathed against the freezing pain. The girl was still alive out there. There were 23 souls left able to walk in Havenwood by the morning. The wind finally broke the 8th day, the air gone suddenly eerily still beneath a sky scrubbed a merciless blue. 17 lay dead in the town behind them, frozen in their solid houses, lost reaching for wood piles, a stone's throw from their doors, crushed beneath roofs that had promised safety and delivered burial instead. Out on the farms and homesteads strung across the county, the count would climb into the dozens before the thaw gave up all its dead. The survivors gathered in the wreck of the church with no fuel left to burn and no food the collapse had not spoiled, and they understood with the clarity of the doomed that another night in Havenwood would finish what the storm had started. There was one chance in the whole frozen county, one fire still burning, one shelter the cold had not breached: the smoke from nowhere. The hole in the ground their alderman had spent a winter trying to find so he could destroy it. Crane did not order them out toward the hill. He had lost the standing to order anyone anything, and he knew it down to the bone. He simply said to the frost-bitten faces turned toward him in the ruined church that he was going to walk west toward that smoke and beg a girl he had wronged to save them, and any who wished to live could follow. Then he stepped out into the killing cold at the head of a ragged column, the strong carrying the weak, the mothers bundling children in, everything they owned, an old woman leaning on a boy who could barely stand himself, all of them strung out across the white waste, all of them betting the last of their warmth on a thread of gray smoke they could only sometimes see. The walk should have killed half of them. It would have, but for the smoke which gave them a star to steer by in a world that had erased every other landmark. They followed it down a long slope that hid the hill's true face around a fold in the land that swallowed the wind through a gap in a scatter of stones that looked like nothing at all. And there, at the end of that impossible passage, they found a seam in the earth they would have walked past 100 times in clear weather. A door. A real wooden door set into a hillside, breathing a faint thread of wood smoke and the impossible smell of warmth and cooking food. It opened before Crane could raise his frozen hand to it. Ingrid stood in the gap with the light of her stove behind her, looking out at the wreckage of the town that had cast her out, at the alderman who had called her an animal now swaying on his feet, with ice in his beard and terror in his eyes, at the children behind him, too cold even to cry. She did not speak for a long moment, and in that silence, Crane understood that she held in the simple act of widening or narrowing that door the lives of every person who had laughed at her, and that nothing in the law or the world could compel her to widen it. She knew his face, she told him at last, her voice steady in a way that frightened him more than any anger could have. She knew the man who had stood in the street and named her a vagrant, who had said no decent soul hid in the ground like a creature. His own words returned to him in the mouth of the girl who held his life in her hand were the heaviest thing the cold had yet laid on him. He did not try to defend himself. He had no defense left in the whole world. There were children with them, he managed through cracked lips. Old people folks who would not see another dawn if she turned them back into the white. He was not asking for himself. He had no right under heaven to ask for himself. The choice Otto had promised her had arrived, and it was exactly as hard as the old man had warned. She could close the door. The law would not touch her for it. Justice itself, the rough prairie justice these very people believed in, might call it fair, an eye returned for an eye. A winter of cruelty answered with one closed door. She thought of the coal she had kept burning in her chest since the day they searched her roof and called her a thief. She thought of how good it would feel for one black moment to let the coal do to them what they had wished onto her. Then she heard Otto's ragged breathing behind her. In the warm dark, the old man who had crawled half a mile through death to warn people who had never once been kind to him. And she knew which voice in her she was going to obey. "Come in," she told them, stepping back from the door. "All of you. There is room." The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they would echo through that country longer than any speech ever shouted from a podium, because they were the moment a wrong girl chose to be larger than the wrong done to her. 23 frozen people stumbled down into the warm dark of a home built for one, and the door that the whole town had hunted all winter closed behind them, at last this time to keep death out rather than to hide a girl away. What followed was not the simple miracle the survivors would later make it into. 23 bodies in a space dug for a single soul strained everything Ingrid had built. The food she had stored to carry one person through a winter now had to stretch across 24 mouths, and the cellar that had felt so abundant in autumn looked suddenly frighteningly finite. She did the arithmetic in her head that first crowded night and did not like the answer. She began rationing at once, half portions, then less, doling out smoked rabbit and boiled roots, with a fairness so rigid that no one, not the children, not the alderman, not herself, took a bite more than another. A full belly tonight, she told them, when a man grumbled, was a frozen grave next week, and she would rather they hated her warm than thanked her dead. The cold outside did not relent just because they had found shelter. The blue sky lied the way blue skies do in that country. The night stayed murderous, 50 below, and worse, and the wood she had so proudly stockpiled burned down with terrifying speed under the demands of a fire that now had to hold off death for 24 instead of one. She watched her woodpile shrink and made a second hard rule that the stove would burn low through the days when bodies packed close could keep one another warm and high only through the worst of the nights. The dugout that had been her sanctuary became a thing she managed by the hour, a fragile balance of heat and fuel and food, and 23 frightened wills, and she carried the weight of that balance alone, because she was the only one who understood it. To pass the endless hours, she set the survivors to small tasks, not because she needed the labor, but because she understood that idle terror in a crowded dark could turn people against one another faster than hunger. She put the children to sorting and counting the stores, made a game of it, let them feel useful. She had the women mend the torn and frozen clothing with bone needles and sinew she had cured herself. She had the men take turns clearing the chimney and the entry of the snow that crept in, and she told them all the stories Otto had told her, the lore of the earth lodges in the patient ground until even the hardest of them began to listen, with something like respect to the wisdom they had mocked. A boy named Asa, no more than 10, took to following her about the dugout, asking endless questions about how it was built, and she answered everyone because she heard in his curiosity the same hunger that had driven her to Otto's door, and she meant to feed it. The strain found its breaking point in a man named Caleb Doss, a big freighter who had lost his wagon and his team and his pride to the storm, and could not bear the smallness of his new place in the world. By the second week in the dugout, the hunger had begun to gnaw at everyone, and Doss had begun to watch the cellar with an intensity Ingrid recognized for exactly what it was. He cornered her one evening while she portioned the night's meal, his voice low and reasonable in the way of a man building towards something ugly. A girl her age, he reasoned, could not be trusted to manage the lives of grown men. The food should be held by someone stronger, someone who could see they were being starved by a child playing at queen of a hole in the ground. He had 3 men who agreed with him, he let her know. He suggested with the false warmth of a threat that she hand over the cellar key before folks got the wrong idea about who was really keeping them alive down here. The room went silent. Children stopped their fidgeting. The survivors who owed her their breath looked at the floor, too cold and too hungry to know whose side living lay on. Ingrid set down the portioning spoon and felt the old coal flare in her chest, the one she had nearly let close the door with, and she understood that this was the true test Otto had meant, the one no amount of dug earth could prepare a soul for. She could not fight Doss with her fists. He outweighed her twice over and stood a head and a half taller. She could only fight him with the one thing she had built that he could never take, which was the truth that she alone knew how to keep them all alive. She did not raise her voice. She told Doss in the room the exact count of the cellar, the precise number of days the food would last at her ration, and the far fewer it would last at his. She told them the wood would not see them to a thaw if a single fire burned high to comfort frightened men. She told them she had not asked for any of them, had been called a thief and an animal by the very people now eating her stores, and had opened her door anyway, and that she would keep opening her hand to feed them so long as breath remained in her body, but that she would not hand the keeping of children's lives to a man whose answer to fear was to eat more than his share. Then she said the thing that settled it quiet as a closing door. Any man strong enough to take this cellar by force, she told Doss, was strong enough to walk out that door and feed himself on the open prairie, and she would gladly hold it open while he went. No one moved toward the door. Doss stood a long moment with his fists working at his sides, measuring the girl against the cold he had crawled out of, against the children, watching against the dawning understanding in the room that everything she had said was simply unanswerably true. The big man's shoulders came down by degrees. He muttered something that was not quite an apology and not quite a threat, and went back to his place along the wall. And the mutiny died not with a blow, but with the recognition spreading face to face around that crowded dark that the smallest and most wrong person in the room was the only one fit to lead it. Crane, who had watched the whole thing from his corner with his frostbitten hands wrapped in rag, understood that he had spent an entire winter trying to destroy the one person in the territory worth following. That night, when the children slept and the stove breathed low and the only sound was 24 people breathing the same warm air, Crane found his way to where Ingrid sat keeping the fire. He had to ask, he told her, his voice scraped raw. After what the town had said, after what he himself had done, after he had ridden out 3 times to drag her back into the cold, why had she not let the prairie have them? Why open the door at all? She was quiet for a while, feeding the stove one careful stick. Because her father would have opened it, she said finally. Because the old man dying in her bed had taught her that surviving was never a thing a person did alone, and that the moment a body decided some other body deserved to freeze was the moment it stopped being worth saving itself. They had not been very good at being people, she told him, looking at the sleeping faces of the ones who had wronged her. But they were people still, even so, and she did not know how to be the kind of creature that let people die just to feel even. Crane wept then silently, the way a man weeps who has held something down for years and finally lacks the strength to hold it any longer. He told her because he could no longer carry it alone, about Sarah, about the 14-year-old daughter he had lost in a cold snap 4 winters past, about the thin roof he had chosen to save money, about how he had spent every season since telling himself that preparation was vanity and the prairie killed whom it pleased, because the alternative was admitting his own faith in walls had buried his child. He had hated Ingrid. He confessed, not for being foolish, but for being right, because her being right meant Sarah had died of his certainty and nothing else. He had wanted the storm to prove the girl wrong so that it could not prove him guilty. Instead, it had proven everything she stood for. And now he sat in the warm dark she had built kept alive by the very wisdom he had mocked, owing his breath to a child he had tried to kill with words. Ingrid let him empty himself out without judgment, because she understood now that his cruelty had been a wound walking around dressed as a man, and that the same grief which had soured him might give an heir turn into something better. She told him the only true thing she had to offer, which was that his Sarah had not died of his love, only of a winter that did not care, and that the lesson he had taken from it had been the wrong one. The earth had been offering to keep that girl warm the whole time, the same way it had kept Ingrid warm, the same way it was keeping them all warm now. The old ways were not vanity. They were only patient waiting for the proud to grow humble enough to listen. It was too late for Sarah. It was not too late for the children sleeping along the walls, or for the man Crane might still decide to become, in whatever years the storm chose to leave him. The days in the dugout taught the survivors things their solid houses never had. They learned what it meant to be truly cold, and then truly warm to be desperate, and then delivered to mock another's preparations, and then need those very preparations to draw another breath. The children invented games in the narrow space between the walls, and their laughter, strange and bright in that buried room, did more to keep the adults from despair than any speech could have. People who had passed Ingrid in the street without a nod now shared with her the small intimacies of survival, told her of their dead, asked her about her father, learned that the animal they had imagined was only a girl who had been clever and brave and alone. The widow Henley, who had burned her own door to save her grandchildren, sat for hours teaching the smallest ones their letters in the dirt of the floor. And Ingrid watched and understood that even ruin could be turned to something if a person refused to let it be only ruin. The storm broke for good in the third week, the cold finally loosening its jaw enough that a person could stand on the hill without dying for it. But the test was not over, because Otto Brandvold was failing. The old man who had crawled through death to warn the undeserving had given out something in that crossing that his body could not rebuild, and Ingrid watched him sink by degrees through those last days, his breath growing shallow, his old smile coming slower and costing more. He was not afraid. He had lived 80 hard years and built the first home in the territory and shaped a girl into the woman who had just saved a town from his own deathbed. And he reckoned he told her between thin breaths that no man got to ask for a better account than that when the ledger was finally called. She held his ruined hands and could not make herself say the goodbye she could see coming. So she said instead, the only thing that mattered, that she would keep the old ways alive, that she would teach what he had taught, that the smoke would never stop rising from the hill, so long as she had breath to feed the fire. The old man smiled his worn-down smile at the crowded, warm dark full of living people who would have been corpses without him, and told her that her father would have stood proud at all of it, and that he, Otto, was proud enough for 2 dead men besides. Then he closed his eyes, and over the next 2 days, he spoke less and slept more, and the survivors fell into a hush around him, understanding that they were keeping vigil over the man whose knowledge had bought every one of their lives. Otto Brandvold died in the gray hour before dawn on the 19th day, when the stove had burned low, and the breathing of 24 sleepers filled the dark like a tide. Ingrid was awake beside him, as she had been every night since he crawled in from the storm, and she felt the moment his hand went slack in hers more than she heard it. There was no struggle in it. The old man simply set down the long burden of his years the way a tired walker sets down a pack at the end of a road, exhaling once into the warm dark of the home he had taught a girl to dig, and then was still. She did not wake the others. She sat holding the cooling hand of the only person who had chosen her when the whole world had thrown her away, and she let herself grieve in silence for the span of one bank fire, because she knew that when the camp woke, she would have to be strong again, and grief was a thing she could only afford in the dark. She told them at first light plainly the way the old man himself would have told them. The survivors received it with a heaviness that surprised her, because most of them had barely known Otto in life, had thought of him as a hermit and a crank when they thought of him at all. But the storm had remade their reckoning of worth. They understood now that the strange old Norwegian, who had crawled half a mile through death to warn a family that was not even home, had spent the last of himself for people who had never earned it, and that the wisdom they were all breathing came down to them through him. The widow Henley wept openly for a man she had never spoken a kind word to in life. And the strangeness of that grief mourning a stranger, while his warm earth kept her alive, was the truest measure of how completely the winter had unmade the old order of things. They could not bury him. The ground above the hill was iron, the cold still deep enough to kill the strength of the camp too spent for the labor of a grave. So Ingrid did the only thing the dead man would have understood, which was to carry his body up to the cold cellar he had taught her to dig, and lay him there wrapped in the buffalo hides he had cached against a need he could not have foreseen to wait for a thaw that would let the living give him back to the earth he had loved. It struck her sealing that cold door that the old man would rest in the very technique he had carried out of the past, kept by the patient ground until spring, hidden the way he had taught her to hide, and she thought there was a rightness in it that softened the grief by a degree she had not expected. The thaw came slowly through the last week of March, the murderous cold loosening its grip a degree at a time until a person could stand on the hill at midday without their breath turning to needles. The survivors began to venture out in pairs, blinking at a world scrubbed white from horizon to horizon, a country wiped so clean of landmark that they could not at first find the direction of the town that had been their whole lives. When they did find it, what they found was not a town. Havenwood was a scatter of broken roofs and snow-choked streets, a place where the dead still lay, where the storm had dropped them, waiting for hands strong enough to dig. The survivors moved through it like people walking through a dream of their own lives, recognizing a doorway here, a fence post there, unable to make the ruin match the memory. The relief wagons reached Dakota Territory in the first week of April, when the trails had opened enough to bear them carrying food and blankets, and the grim work of accounting for the dead. They had braced themselves for a graveyard. What they did not expect, what no one in the relief party could quite credit, when the survivors told it, was that 23 souls had ridden out the worst storm in the territory's memory, inside a hole in a hillside kept alive for the better part of 3 weeks by a 17-year-old girl the town had cast out to die. The story traveled ahead of the wagons the way the smoke had traveled all winter, and by the time the Easterners with their notebooks and their questions arrived, the smoke from nowhere had stopped being a joke whispered in a saloon and become the only thing the whole shattered county wanted to talk about. Among the first things the relief brought was news that closed the account on Mabel Halverson, and the manner of its closing carried a justice no court could have improved upon. The widow's fine, solid house, the homestead she had stolen from a grieving girl with the cold authority of the law, had failed in the storm, like so many others, its roof gone. Its walls breached the woman herself, dragged half-frozen from the wreckage by a neighbor, who had no particular love for her, but could not leave a body to die in the snow. She had survived but barely, and she had survived with nothing. The estate she had seized now a ruin of snapped timber and spoiled stores. There was a harder blow waiting for her still. When she pressed her claim at the land office for the 30 acres she had ridden out to steal in February, she learned that the parcel already bore a stronger name than her spite. Filed in trust the previous November by an old man now lying frozen in a cellar, with witnesses ready to swear that the ground passed to Ingrid Halverson on the day she came of age. The widow who had emptied a girl's world with a handful of flat words found her own world emptied by a single line of ink she had never seen coming. She left the territory before the snow was fully off the ground, riding east with whatever she could carry. A woman who had wagered everything on the law and discovered too late that the law properly used by a patient old man could guard the weak as surely as it could arm the cruel. Ingrid did not gloat when the news reached her. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she felt nothing toward Mabel at all anymore, neither triumph nor pity, only the distant flatness a person feels toward a danger that has passed her by in the dark. The coal she had carried in her chest since autumn had burned down to ash somewhere in the long, crowded dark of the storm, and she discovered she was glad to be rid of its weight. The reckoning that mattered more came on the day the relief wagons formed up to carry the survivors towards shelter in the next county over, when Josiah Crane asked to speak before the gathered crowd. He stood in the trampled snow at the foot of the hill that had saved them all before the survivors and the relief workers and the Easterners with their notebooks poised, a man visibly remade by the winter. His bandaged hands held stiff at his sides, his face stripped of every certainty he had carried into the storm. He owed this young woman his life. He told them, his voice breaking on the words. He owed her an apology that no number of remaining years could fully pay. He had stood in the street of a dead town and called her an animal. He had named her a vagrant, a thief, a creature unfit for decent company. He had ridden out 3 times to find her shelter and tear it down. And when the storm came for all of them, the girl he had hunted had opened her door to him. Without a moment's hesitation had fed him from her own stores, had warmed him. At her own fire had kept his worthless life going while better people than him froze in their solid houses. He turned to Ingrid then, and for the first time since she had known him, his eyes held nothing but a naked, unguarded humility. He had been wrong about everything he told her before all of them. Wrong about her, wrong about what survival truly looked like. Wrong about the very meaning of the word decent, which he had thrown at her all winter like a stone without ever once understanding what it weighed. She was, he said, his voice failing him at the last, the most decent soul he had met in his life, and he had spent that winter proving himself the worst kind of fool a man could be. The confession cost him everything he had left to spend, and the crowd received it in a silence so complete that the only sound was the drip of melting snow from the eaves of the hidden door. Ingrid let the silence hold a moment before she answered, because she understood that what she said now would outlive her, would be carried east in the notebooks, and west in the survivors' memories, would become the meaning the whole country took from a winter that had nearly erased it. She had not built her home to prove anyone wrong, she told them, her voice steady and clear across the trampled snow. She had built it because she had nowhere else in the world to go. She had learned from her father and from the old man now resting in her cellar how to work alongside the earth instead of against it, how to listen to what the old ways remembered that the new ways had been too proud to keep. A person could laugh at another's preparations, she said, looking out at the faces of the people she had saved. They could call it madness, call it animal, call it whatever made them feel taller in the moment. But the storm always came in the end to every life that was ever lived. And when it came, the ones who had made ready were the ones who walked out the far side of it. And if those prepared souls were good, she finished, they would not walk out alone. They would carry the unready out with them, because that was the only thing worth surviving for. The words settled over the gathered crowd like the first warm air of a true spring, and more than one of the hard frontier faces turned toward that hillside was wet with something other than melting frost. The Easterners wrote it all down. The survivors carried it home in their hearts. The smoke from nowhere, the thing that had been a punchline in a saloon all winter, became in the space of a single speech, a kind of scripture for that battered country, a story parents would tell their children for 2 generations about the girl who was thrown into the ground and chose to rise as mercy rather than vengeance. In the weeks that followed, as the relief settled, the living and the deepening thaw finally yielded the dead. A great many people came to the hill who had never bothered to find it, when finding it might have saved their pride. They came to see the home that should not have worked the hole in the ground that had outlasted every solid house in the county. Ingrid showed them what Otto had shown her, walked them through the long entry that broke the wind, set their hands against the earthen walls that held their patient warmth. No matter what the air above did, let them stand in the warm dark and understand in their own bodies what their proud minds had refused to credit. She held nothing back. The old man had taught her that wisdom hoarded was wisdom wasted, and she meant to spend his freely for the rest of her days. When the ground had softened enough to give in that same spring of the great storm, they buried Otto Brandvold on the crown of the hill he had taught her to dig into in the first true grave the season allowed. The whole surviving county came, which was a strange and fitting thing. 24 people who would not have crossed a street for the old hermit in life, now standing bareheaded at his grave, because his death had bought their breathing. They set a stone over him that Ingrid had chosen the words for herself, words that held the whole shape of what he had been and what he had given. He taught us how to disappear, the stone read, and beneath it we learned how to survive. There was no name in the territory after that spring who did not understand exactly what those words meant or who had earned the right to carry them. Ingrid Halverson never left Dakota Territory. She could have. The Easterners offered her a kind of fame, the relief workers offered her passage to gentler country, and more than one of the surviving families would have taken her in now as a daughter, where they had once turned their backs. She refused them all. The hill was hers, recorded in her name by the patient hand of a dead man, and she had bled into its soil through a whole winter to make it a home. She rebuilt in the warming season, not abandoning the dugout, but enlarging it, raising a proper homestead against the hillside that married the old ways to the new, a house with timber and glass above ground for the gentle months and the deep warm earth below, for when the prairie turned cruel again, as she knew with certainty it always would. She did not build it alone. Among the men who had come west with the relief wagons was a Norwegian carpenter named Soren Vik, a quiet, broad-handed man who had meant only to help dig out a stricken county and move on to his own life, but who found after the first day on the hill that he could not stop thinking about the girl who had carved herself into the earth and chosen to open her door to the very people who had wronged her. He stayed through the spring on one excuse after another, mending what the storm had broken until the excuses ran thin, and the only honest reason left to stay was the one he had been circling all along. He told her plainly the way the people of that country told one another the things that mattered most, that he had crossed half a continent to bury strangers and had found instead the one person he could not bear to leave behind. She did not answer with pretty words because she had never learned the use of them, but she answered, and that was enough for them both. They married before the first snow of the following winter in a ceremony held on the crown of the hill within sight of Otto's stone because Ingrid would not be wed anywhere. The old man could not in some sense attend. They raised 4 children on that hillside over the years that followed 2 sons and 2 daughters. Every one of them taught from the time they could walk the things their mother had learned in blood and grief. The children learned to read a storm in the way the cattle stood and the birds flew. They learned to work alongside the land rather than against it. They learned to dig into the patient earth and to keep a fire that could be seen for miles. And they learned most of all the lesson their mother held above every skill of survival, that the whole purpose of being ready was so that you might carry the unready through. Josiah Crane never fully recovered from the winter, but the breaking of him turned out to be the making of a better man than the storm had found. He resigned the office he had disgraced, sold what little the storm had left him, and spent the remainder of his years trying to pay down a debt he understood could never be fully settled, traveling the county to teach the very preparations he had once mocked, telling any soul who would listen the story of the girl in the ground and the daughter he had buried under his own certainty. He became in a turn that astonished everyone who had known the old Crane, one of Ingrid's nearest friends, a frequent and welcome presence at her table, a man humbled past his pride into something gentler and far truer. He had buried one daughter to the cold, he told her once late in life, his scarred hands folded in his lap. The prairie had given him no way to undo that. But it had given him the chance to spend his last years honoring the girl who had taught him far too late for his own Sarah, but not too late for the children of others, that no roof was ever worth the soul of the family it was built to shelter. The phrase smoke from nowhere outlived all of them. It entered the working speech of the Dakota settlers and stayed there for generations, meaning any preparation that looked like madness right up until the hour it became salvation. Any quiet readiness the proud were too clever to understand. When a man was laughed at for his stockpiles, for his caution, for the strange shelters he dug against storms that had not yet come, the old-timers who remembered the winter of 1887 would shake their heads at the laughter and say, "Only remember the smoke from nowhere. Remember Ingrid Halverson," and that was usually enough to quiet a room. The mockery would die the way Caleb Doss's mutiny had died, not with an argument, but with the slow spread of understanding through the listeners that the cautious one among them might be the only one who would live to see the thaw. Some stories of that hard country ended in blood, in the long ledgers of grievance and revenge the prairie kept as carefully as it kept its dead. But this one ended in something rarer and harder won. A girl was cast out into the cold with nothing but the clothes she stood in and the knowledge an old man had given her. She dug herself a home in the patient earth where the proud could not find her, kept a fire burning all the long winter that the whole town laughed at, and when the storm came that scoured the county down to its bones, she opened her door to every soul who had wronged her. Not because she wanted vindication, though vindication came in full. Not because she sought to prove the alderman a fool, though she proved it past all argument. She opened that door because the old man dying in her bed had taught her and her father before him that survival meant nothing at all if a person carried it alone into the spring, and that the true measure of a life was never the storms it managed to outlast, but the number of frozen strangers it found the heart to thaw. The smoke kept rising from that hillside for the rest of her long life, no longer a mystery to anyone in the county, but a standing promise, a sign that on the hill where a cast-out girl had buried herself and risen as mercy, there was always a fire kept burning, and a door that would open to whoever the night had not yet finished with.